Hello, friends. My name is Bill Davis. I am the Senior Director of Theological Education Fund's development. This is the podcast Leading Theologically. And today I am joined by our dear friend David LaMotte, a singer-songwriter, a peacemaker. His recent TEDx talk has gone somewhat viral as an editor's choice selection. David, welcome to Leading Theologically.
It's such a pleasure, Bill. It's always good to see you. I am grateful for our long friendship and for this time today. Thanks.
Likewise, my friend. David, as I've been starting this work at the Presbyterian Foundation, thinking about how leaders are formed for churches in our denomination and our world, I just can't help but get out of my mind the intersectionality between theological education and what you posit into the world as world changing. And so just would love to have a conversation about that today. And so to start off, tell us a little bit about world changing, what that means for you, for us collectively. Let's start there.
Well, it's a little bit of a cheeky term because it sounds so very grandiose. And part of what I'm doing is trying to really take a harder look at the word itself and acknowledge that, as the title of the book says, it's not possible to live in the world and not change it. Everybody does. I think it's a little bit problematic and extremely common that we use these three phrases interchangeably: change the world and fix the world and save the world, as though they mean the same thing. And they don't. I would suggest that if you think you can fix the world, that's completely naive. If you think you can save the world, maybe that's not your gig. I think that job might be taken. Right. But if you think you can change the world, you're just paying attention, because the truth is that all of us are changing the world, whether we like it or not. Yeah. But the implications of that for our daily lives are actually bigger than it seems at first. This can all sound a little trite at first examination, but you look at it a little more deeply. And part of what I'm learning and have learned in the last couple of decades of studying this is the depth and breadth and ubiquity of the hero narrative in our culture. And by hero narrative, I'm not talking about the Robert Bly hero's journey stuff. I mean that we have different narratives of how social change happens. And the one that we most often tell is a hero narrative where somebody really special does something really dramatic in a moment of crisis and then fixes the problem. And then we roll the credits and move on to the next problem. Yeah. And that's simply never in the history of the world happened. Not once. But it's how we tell the story of social change all the time. It has never happened that a hero in the absence of a movement has effectively addressed a large-scale problem. And I can hear some of you watching this right now in my head saying, wait, what about Jesus? I'm saying, yes, okay, let's take a look, because you can look through either lens at the story, but the story looks really different depending on which lens you're looking through. So if you look through a hero lens, then the theological proposition is that Jesus came and died for us and paid our debts, and our job is really just to clap. In theological language, to praise and worship. And then it stops there. If you switch hermeneutics, if you switch to a movement lens, then the story looks very different. The story becomes something closer to, oh, well, Jesus also came to invite me into the work of loving the world, to build a movement for God's love in the world, right? And that means that has massive implications for our theology and for our daily lives. If I'm called to join Jesus in the work of loving the world, to emulate Jesus and to emulate his followers, then that's a really different story theologically, right? It's not for me to say, which lens people should look through, but I do want to point out that the story looks really, really different when we look through these different lenses. And I think it's significant that when Jesus' ministry started, almost the first thing that happened after the time in the desert, the next thing that happened was that he called the 12. Right? He started to build the movement. He gathered the people around him that he needed. And that's not the whole story, but it's a really important part of the story.
Yeah. Well, and I love that, David, about the beginning of the movement, right? And the beginning of Jesus' life. It doesn't happen. And thinking about some of the stories you tell in this TEDx talk and some of the songs that you sing and their narratives, things don't happen in vacuums, right? We are always in relationship with something else, right?
Right.
And so whether or not that's whether or not that's an idea or another person, right? We can't do this work
Mm-hmm.
by ourselves.
Yeah, and I'd go even farther to say, set aside the ideas. We can't do this without other people,
Mm,
not effectively.
yeah,
And yet that's the way we tell the story.
yeah.
We always reduce the stories of
Mm,
big impact to individuals. Let's face it, for most of us, the life of Rosa Parks was one day
yeah.
long,
Mm,
right? It all
yes.
came down to this dramatic action she took on
Mm,
December 1st, 1955.
mhm,
And the rest of it was just kind of details,
right.
preparation and aftermath. And that's simply not true. Rosa
Mm,
Parks' own work for 20 years before and decades after that day was very significant.
yeah.
Bill,
Yeah.
I'm concerned about that background noise. Are you getting a lot of that school bus?
I heard it, but not loudly.
Okay.
Um,
Um, I'm at least going
oh,
to just take a moment to close the window
yep, sure enough.
all the way. Excuse me.
Okay.
So
All
I
right.
can go on about that if you like. I want to articulate that I'm not saying people don't do heroic things, but that's a terrible model for large scale change.
Sure. Yeah, so let's pick it up here. Um, David, I wonder about if we do this work not just ourselves, we do it in community, we do it in relationship because we have to live with others. How do we cultivate practices to do this work?
Mm,
Um, right? How do we get out of our heads and into our bodies
mm, mm-hmm,
as we do engage in this work together?
mm-hmm. Yeah, these are good questions, Bill. And again, I think it's not just because we have to live with each other, but because we're going to be utterly ineffective by ourselves.
Hmm.
Um, that movements really are what make things change.
Yeah.
And so if you want to see a world that is more loving, if you want to see a world that's more just, then that has to involve working with other people. So the ironic thing is that when we study leadership,
Hmm.
so much attention is given to the idea of how we express ourselves and
Hmm.
how articulate we can be and how purpose driven, etc. Very little about how we listen to each other and how we take input and actually have the humility to examine other perspectives and develop empathy for
Yeah.
other ways of looking at things,
Yeah.
which is a really important part of peace and justice work.
Yeah.
Justice work is not just about beating other people over the head and saying do right. It's actually about understanding how they came to where they are and what actually has led them to this place and this position, this worldview.
Yeah. So it's David, I'm thinking back to a seminary professor, right? And during times of theological education at seminary, we do a lot of deconstruction and reconstructing,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so this professor, they said to me, um, Bill, I'm not interested in breaking things apart anymore. I just want to be a part of putting them back together,
Hmm.
right? How do we, in this world that is so complex, right? Um, how do we begin in your mind? How do we begin to put things back together?
Well, I think I would love your professor. My son's name is Mason because our
Yeah.
sending prayer for him into the world was that he be one who builds rather than one who tears
Mm,
down,
yeah.
like a stonemason.
Yeah.
And I think the irony is that we often forget about that part of the work.
Yeah.
Activism is equated with protest.
Hmm.
Protest means interrupting something that's wrong or standing in the way of it, calling
Mhm.
it out, and I think often it's more effective to call in, right, to invite
Mm.
people into a better way
Mm.
rather than just condemning. But protest is only half of activism. The other half is building what's right, offering a better way forward. My
Yeah.
favorite example, my favorite experiment with that, I guess, in my own work
Hmm.
was the decade I spent as a part of Abraham Jam with my
Mm.
friends Billy Jonas and Dawood Warnsby Ali,
Yes.
who are Jewish and Muslim, respectively.
Hmm.
And the three of us had this band and called it Abraham Jam because
Hmm.
the three of us were singing literally and figuratively in harmony, not
Mm.
singing the same note, but singing different notes that can
Hmm.
resonate together.
Yeah.
So, so I think that is, you're putting your finger on something very important.
Mm.
How do we do that work of building? And I think, again, step one has to be stopping asking, what can I do? And
Mm.
asking, where is the we?
Mm.
Where are my people? And what
Yes.
can we do?
Yeah.
And that is so, that rugged individualism is
Yep.
so incredibly woven into our culture
Yep.
that I've written a whole book about this, and I still can't
Yeah.
seem to deprogram myself. Right
Right.
when the current bombardment of Gaza started,
Mm.
um, I spent several weeks just saying, okay, trying to write something about this,
Hmm.
trying to write a
Hmm.
statement that I could get behind and defend and feel like would be constructive rather than
Yeah.
destructive.
Yeah.
And it took me weeks before I went, oh, wait a minute. I'm a part of Abraham Jam,
Huh.
and we have a particular
Yeah.
place to speak from
Yeah.
as a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian.
Yeah.
The three of us whose views on this conflict are not so far apart, actually.
Mm.
Um, though our wording, we worked for a very long time to
Yeah.
craft a statement, which we
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel good about the statement. I think it's right. Um, as one part of the ongoing conversation. It certainly doesn't answer all the questions, but I think it's an important part of the conversation. And it
Mhm.
took me so long to come to the idea that, oh, wait a minute, the question is not what can I do? The question is, where is my we and what can we do? And
Mm.
that's just a massive reorientation to
Yes.
the work at hand.
Yes. Well, and we've been talking that, this conversation right now we are having is at the beginning of a political
Mm-hmm.
cycle, right?
Yep.
And I know you've done some work in other political cycles about how a person identifies their we as working with neighbors, right? Can you
Mm-hmm.
tell us a little bit about that work, David, and just what it means for you to how do we think about neighbors during this crazy tumultuous time?
Well, we've got another 5 minutes or so, right? I should be able to wrap this up. Um, just make it
Yeah,
easy. I've got the
yeah,
instructions right here.
great.
No, it's obviously really hard. This is
Yeah.
really hard because what we're trying to hold in tension is some deeply held beliefs, right? Beliefs. Making peace is not making nice,
Mm,
right?
mm,
Pretending everything's cool. Hey, we're just going to be buddies anyway.
yeah,
That is not peacemaking. That is not the work of justice.
mm,
However, dehumanizing other people is also not the work of peace or justice,
right,
right? So, how do we build a relationship that can handle the hard conversations?
yeah,
I think you start with relationship
mm,
and with a whole lot of listening,
mhm,
and then you can have the hard conversations. Frankly, I am not interested in street corner preachers. I
mm,
don't know them. I don't
yeah,
know why I should trust them, if they are people of integrity, if their lives are rooted in love. I just don't
mm,
know. I just know they're screaming about something
right,
on the corner. And I just don't care until I know who you are. But if I see light shining in your life and I see you as a kind and loving person, I want to know more about that.
mm,
And if you are those things and you have a different political affiliation from me or whatever, then I'm really curious, right? I
yeah,
really want to understand how the world looks to you because different lives teach different lessons. and you're
Yes.
experiencing something that I haven't experienced. I'm
Yes.
open to learning. I've also experienced some things you haven't experienced. I'm open to sharing those if you're interested.
Yeah.
But if you're not interested, there is no point in me trying to share them.
Right.
And my experience has been that you're not going to be interested until you feel heard, not agreed
Yeah.
with, but heard.
Yeah. So I wonder how much of that, David, is finding common vocabulary, do you think? How much of it is finding commonality when there's difference? Do we have to identify something? And I ask this because I think theological education gives us language to talk about the important things when we approach them from different perspectives,
Mm, mm,
right? So I
mm.
wonder how much a shared vocabulary plays in this conversation.
Yeah, I think words matter, and
Right.
which ones we choose certainly matter a great deal. My friend Gareth Higgins teaches me a
Mm,
lot of good things, and
yeah.
one of my closest friends. And Gareth has spoken about how we can find words that mean the same things that aren't automatically triggering and drawing a building a wall between us, right? For some folks, even the word justice is
Mm,
a button pusher.
yes.
Because of my theology, it's not for me. It's woven pretty deeply into core tenets of the faith.
Hmm.
Um, you know, yeah, I don't need to explain this to you.
Right.
It's a big part of Christianity, as I understand it, and seek to live it out. But for some people, it's a big button pusher. And he said, like Gareth said, the word fairness really means about the same thing, and it's a
Mm,
lot less confrontational
yeah.
for folks. So, like, that's a thing we can talk about. Where do you see things as unfair?
Yeah.
Where do you see things? Where's the possibility to make things more fair?
Hmm.
And if you can start from the idea that we both want the world to be fair,
Yeah.
then that's pretty powerful. Now, maybe you can't actually.
Mm,
Maybe there are folks whose value systems are no, really. If it tilts toward me, I'm good with that.
yeah. Yeah.
And that there are folks, but I think they're a very small minority. Actually, I
Yeah.
think a lot of people that we would quickly place in that category of believing that don't believe that.
Sure.
It's just really hard to see people through screens.
Mm, yes. Yes. So I know I want to talk some about the TEDx talk because this is where I think I hear you flesh out some of these ideas. And in the TEDx talk, David, um, you give a shout out that all Presbyterians love, or at least those of us that are decent and in order. And you talk about the good work that committees do together, right?
Yeah.
So, how do share some about the place of a committee, the place of moving
Mm.
towards collective action so that we do break through this hero narrative that says, I have to do this on my own.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard for me to not spend all my time explaining what I'm not saying when I talk
Mm,
about these topics.
yeah.
So I'll try not to offer too many disclaimers. But the title of the talk is "Why Heroes Don't Change the World,"
Hmm.
and that's a title that was chosen by TED. Actually, we sent them a
Mm,
different title, and I
yeah.
love it. I think they nailed it. That's exactly
Mm,
right.
mm,
What I'm not saying is that people don't do heroic things. People
yeah.
do extraordinarily heroic things. It's so beautiful
Yeah.
to see the sacrifices folks are willing to make for strangers often.
Hmm.
Those stories are in the newspaper pretty often, and
Mm,
they also are lived out by people I know, right? Very quietly a lot of the time. Folks who give up their careers to care for a sick relative, those kinds of sacrifices. The thing is, those stories of individual heroism don't scale.
mm,
If we are looking at a large scale problem, a societal level problem,
hmm.
it just doesn't happen that a hero in the absence of a movement changes
Mm,
the world, right?
hmm.
It's always the movement that changes the world, but we reduce it to the hero story. So returning to Rosa Parks, which is
Yeah.
arguably an archetypal story of change in our culture, you can't talk about social change for very long without her name coming up.
Right.
And And yet, the way we tell the story is so reduced. And I won't go through the entire thing at this point, but I'll just note that we don't tell in school the story, or very, very rarely, of Joanne Robinson and the Women's Political Council, which was
Yeah.
an organization of over 200 African American women who had had the boycott organized and ready to go for over a year before Rosa Parks was arrested,
Mhm.
and chose not to amplify several arrests of women who did roughly what Rosa Parks did,
Mhm.
because it was not exactly right for the movement to hold this up as their example for one reason or another. If it were the heroic action that made the change, we would know all those women's names. Everybody
Right.
would know who Aurelia Browder is.
Huh.
Everybody would know who Viola White is. Everybody would know who Claudette Colvin is. And there has been some resurgence in interest in Claudette Colvin's story recently.
Mm.
I'm glad to see that. But the point remains that we act like it's this heroic action that made the difference. Rosa Parks herself said, "That day was not so different from many other days for me.
Mm.
What was different was that all the people showed up."
Yeah.
That's a pretty close
Mm.
approximation of her exact words.
Yeah.
It was the movement that made the
Mhm.
difference. And it always is. And that's great news for you and me and
Right.
people who care about love in the world, because
Yeah.
it means that we're not powerless, but our power isn't individual. Our power
Right.
lies in the power of gathering with others to figure out what's our strategy, what's an achievable goal, what do we have to work with,
Mhm.
what would we like to see different, how can we lay a timeline on this difference that we want to make, what are our strategies, who's going to do what, and when are we getting back together to
Yeah.
figure out who did what? And that, my friend, is a committee, right? And it has always been groups of people doing exactly that that
Yeah.
changed the world. It has
Yeah.
always been. If you're
Yeah.
looking at large scale change, groups of people who have gathered to do those things and then
Yeah.
go back to the top and do the next thing.
Yeah.
And that's really exciting for me, because it
Mm.
means that I'm not powerless just because I'm not Gandhi.
Yeah.
Gandhi wasn't Gandhi either without that
Mm.
whole movement.
Yeah. David, that's fascinating. And one of the places where my mind goes is acknowledging where power lies in committees,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that as a mid 40s white man, chances are when I walk into a room, I have power whether I want it or not,
That's right.
right? And so part of my job when I show up to do committee work is to make space for voices who of people who don't look like me, right? And
Absolutely.
and
Or are unlike you in various ways that put
yeah,
people outside of the mainstream rather than in
right.
the mainstream.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I love about our theological education in the PCUSA right now is the diversity of seminary faculty, the diversity
Mm-hmm.
of seminary presidents,
Mm-hmm.
right? That to use some of our confessional language, voices long silenced are now coming to have seats of power at tables.
Yeah.
And for movements, that just excites me, especially this movement of thinking about theological education, right?
Yeah.
That we are doing this together to make the world better for all of
Mhm.
God's children. Um,
I really appreciate you naming that, Bill. I think that's spot on. That a lot of the time our job is to be quieter in a room of people who have more direct experience, who have lived experience of things that we care about, but we haven't experienced.
yeah,
That's just hugely important.
yeah,
Appreciate you naming
yeah.
that.
Thanks, David. So our time is wrapping up. And I am so appreciative of this conversation. And we've used a lot of words today, right? And the hope that I hear you sharing through the TED Talk, through your book, through your music, is that our words transform us into action. And so I'm grateful for you. And so I want to ask a final question about words. Maybe it's about music, maybe it's about a sermon or a podcast or a
Mhm.
conversation. But David, what's the best thing you've heard lately?
Hmm. So I'll say again, words matter, right? I
Yeah.
appreciate you naming that. There's a lot of people you hear people say, look, can we stop talking and do something? I'm like,
Yeah.
well, yes, and right. It is true. There is paralysis of analysis that can happen. And if we don't think things through as best we can before we get started, we're likely to head in a direction we didn't want to go. So I think the idea, I love Thoreau's lovely words about that. If you've built castles in the air, your work need not be lost. Now go and build their foundations.
Yeah.
Right. But in order to picture where we're going, that the dreaming is the first stage. So yeah, the best thing I've heard lately actually came out years ago, and I just came back across it in the last couple of days. Jean Rowe is Rohe, is a singer-songwriter whose work I really admire. I'm about to do some work with her. I don't really know her well personally, but I'm really excited to get to know her better. She wrote a song called Arise and made a video of it with a whole choir and a horn section and just and strings, extraordinary instrumentation, all live in a big room together. And it's just such a beautiful thing. I cry every time I watch it. It calls to the best part of me and my highest hopes. Jean Rowe, Arise. Anybody can find that on YouTube.
Yeah, we'll do our best to link to it here in the comments as well.
Great.
To make it easier for people. And David, we are about to be at Austin Seminary here in a few days together. And I imagine if folks want to talk to you more about this conversation, to hear more of these ideas fleshed out, they can talk to the good folks of the South Central APC region or Austin Seminary to find out more about that event, and to hopefully come and spend some time with both of us, as I'll be there as well. And David, I am grateful for you, for your work, for your witness in the world, and for your time talking to us about the work that you are doing leading theologically today. So
likewise, my friend, I appreciate you being interested, and I very much look forward to being together and playing a little music together. I'm so glad you're bringing your cello.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, my friend, we'll talk soon.
See you soon.